Imagine a corrupt HOA bulldozing your family's sacred land, building a massive commercial plaza on it, and laughing in your face, only to realize too late that you've just let them construct their own downfall on property that was never theirs. Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. The HOA put 12 commercial buildings on my land, but they made one huge mistake. They thought I was just some quiet old man. They tore down my fence, bulldozed the memorial I built for my late wife, and laughed when I showed them my deed. Their lawyer called me a bitter old man clinging to dirt. So I decided to let them finish. I watched them pour the concrete, build the walls, and cut the ribbon for their grand opening. What they didn't know was that every single nail they hammered was just another piece of the trap I was setting. A trap hidden inside the one thing they were too arrogant to ever check. It all started on a Tuesday. The sound was wrong. Not the usual morning sounds of birds or a distant lawn mower, but a deep rhythmic crunching metal on wood, again and again. I was in the kitchen pouring coffee and the mug just stopped halfway to my mouth. I put it down and walked to the back window, the one that overlooks the 5 acres my father left me. For a moment, my brain didn't quite catch up to what my eyes were seeing. A big yellow backhoe, its hydraulic arm swinging like a prize fighter, was systematically knocking down the old split-rail fence that had marked my property line for as long as I could remember. Each post splintered and fell with a sigh of defeated wood. My fence on my land. Behind the machine, a young man in a crisp polo shirt, with an HOA logo embroidered on it, was looking down at a clipboard, making a little check mark. I walked out the back door, not even bothering to change out of my slippers. The morning air was cool, but something hot was starting to burn in my chest. I didn't run. I just walked steady, the way you do when you want to show you're not rattled, even if you are. "Excuse me," I said, my voice louder than I intended. The young man, who couldn't have been more than 30, looked up. He had that clean, overly confident look of someone who's never had a callus on his hand. He gave me a thin, practiced smile. "Morning," he said, like he was greeting me at a country club. "Can I help you?" I pointed with my chin toward the backhoe. "You're tearing down my fence," I said. It wasn't a question. He glanced at the splintered wood, then back at his clipboard, tapping it with a pen. "This lot was officially annexed by the Community Association last year, sir. Part of the new expansion plan?" He said it so casually, as if he were telling me the weather. He waved a hand dismissively toward the woods. "This is all slated for commercial development. If you have an issue, you can take it up at the next board meeting. The schedule is on the website." My blood ran cold. Annexed. This land wasn't just some forgotten parcel. It was the last piece of my father's old homestead. He'd signed it over to me quietly years ago before he passed, making me promise to just let it be. And I had. It wasn't for anything but being. 5 acres of old pines and oaks, a little stream cutting through the middle. After my wife Sarah passed, I'd put a simple oak bench right by that stream in the spot where we'd scattered her ashes. It wasn't fancy, just a quiet place to sit and remember. The young man followed my gaze toward the trees. A sneer, quick but unmistakable, tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Look, I get it. People get sentimental about things," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "But this place is going commercial. You want to leave a shrine, you can do it somewhere else. Progress, you know. A shrine." He called my wife's memorial a shrine. He called my promise to my father sentimentality. And he called this destruction progress. I turned without another word and walked back to the house. Anger wasn't going to fix this. I'm an engineer by trade, retired now, but my brain still works on logic, on facts, on blueprints and deeds. A mistake had been made, and a piece of paper would correct it. I found the original deed in my filing cabinet, the heavy paper folded neatly in a manila envelope. The county seal was still crisp. My name, Ray Dalton, was right there. I made a clean copy and walked over to the HOA community office, a sterile-looking building by the golf course. The woman at the desk looked up from her computer with an air of profound boredom. I explained the situation calmly, laying the copy of the deed on the counter. She barely glanced at it. She called for someone in the back, and out came the clipboard kid from the fence line. Camden Sharp, his name tag read. He didn't offer to shake my hand. "We've been over this," he said, not even looking at me, but at the paper. He pushed it back across the counter. The board approved the redevelopment under the Community Eminent Domain Clause for unincorporated parcels. It's for the greater good of the neighborhood. Community Eminent Domain. That's not a thing. Eminent domain is a government power. A serious one, not something a handful of people on a homeowners association board can just invent. They were making up words, banking on the idea that I was just an old man who would get confused and go away. They brushed me off. They told me to file a formal complaint, which they'd review at the end of the quarter. It was a bureaucratic dead end, and we all knew it. I left the office with the copy of my deed still in my hand. A deep sinking feeling settled in my stomach. These people weren't making a mistake. They were counting on their power, on their pile of bylaws, and their smirking confidence to be stronger than my piece of paper. The next morning, the sound was worse. It wasn't the crunch of a fence post anymore. It was the high-pitched scream of chainsaws and the heavy, earth-shaking rumble of a bulldozer. I walked to the edge of what used to be my property line. They had already cleared a 50-FD path into the woods. The pines my dad had planted were gone, just stumps now. I scanned the trees, looking for the clearing by the stream, my heart pounding in my ears. But it wasn't there. The whole area was just gone. Torn earth, uprooted saplings, and raw red mud. And in the middle of it all, I could see splintered pieces of oak half buried in the dirt. My bench, Sarah's bench. They hadn't just moved it. They had driven right over it, grinding it into the ground like it was nothing more than a fallen branch. The stream was already starting to run brown with the churned-up soil. That evening, they finished their work for the day. And before they left, they put up a new fence, a tall, cold chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. It wasn't to keep people out of the construction site. It was to keep one person out. Me. I stood there as the sun went down, looking through the steel mesh at the scar they had ripped across my land, at the grave of a memory. The hot burn in my chest was gone now, replaced by something cold and heavy. They thought they had won. They thought they had fenced me out. But all they had really done was lock me in with an idea. My first move wasn't anger, it was research. The next morning, I drove down to the county clerk's office, the old stone building downtown that smells like dust and paper. I spent an hour pulling records, feeling the familiar comfort of process and procedure. I started with my own deed, confirmed it was filed correctly, no liens, no transfers. Then I asked for the county's official plat maps for my section. The clerk, a kind woman with bifocals, slid a heavy book across the counter. I found my parcel outlined in black ink exactly where it had always been. Finally, I asked to see all recent filings related to the neighboring community association. And that's when I found it. It was a new plat filed 8 months ago. It was a clean, modern-looking map generated by a computer, not hand-drawn like the old ones. It showed my 5 acres absorbed into the HOA's territory. The property lines simply erased and redrawn to include my land in their commercial zone. But something was wrong with it. The signature for the county surveyor looked off, too perfect, and the filing number was out of sequence. I pulled the original plat map again and laid them side by side. The forgery was obvious if you knew what to look for. They hadn't just annexed my land. They had faked the paperwork to do it. They had committed fraud. Armed with my evidence, I made an appointment with a lawyer. He was a decent guy, but his face fell as I laid out the story and the documents. "You're right, Ray," he said, tapping the forged plat. "This looks like a clear case of title fraud. The problem is they have deep pockets and we don't." He explained that fighting the HOA in court would be a war of attrition. They'd file motion after motion, delay, appeal, bleed me dry. He estimated it could take years and cost tens of thousands of dollars I didn't have, with no guarantee a judge would see it our way against a powerful community association. Their lawyers will argue you abandoned the property, that it was a clerical error, that the community's needs outweigh your individual claim. He sighed. They'll bury you in paper. My advice? Take a settlement if they offer one. I walked out of his office feeling emptier than before. The piece of paper I thought was my shield had just been called a losing hand. That's when the nights got bad. I'd fall asleep and dream of Sarah. We were back at the stream, the sun warm on our faces. Then the ground would start to shake, and that horrible sound of the bulldozer would fill the air. I'd try to stand to shout, but I couldn't move. I'd just have to watch as the mud and torn-up trees buried everything. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs, the feeling of guilt like a physical weight on my chest. I hadn't protected her place. I had failed. The HOA didn't let up. They were escalating. A certified letter arrived one afternoon, a formal trespass warning. It said if I was seen on or near the construction zone, I would be arrested. It was signed by Tina Marston, vice president of the HOA board. I knew who she was, a former realtor who always wore pantsuits a size too tight and had a smile that never reached her eyes. She drove around the neighborhood in her oversized SUV like a warden inspecting her prison yard. She was the one who wrote up citations for trash cans left out an hour too long or grass that was half an inch too high. She fed on that tiny taste of power. A few days later, she was standing by the chain-link fence with Camden Sharp pointing toward the construction. I was getting the mail and she saw me. She marched right over to my driveway. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I'm getting reports that you've been aggressive toward our contractors. I need to remind you that this is now private community property. Your hostility is not welcome." I hadn't spoken a single word to her contractors. I had only stood there watching them destroy my life. But I was the one being called aggressive. I saw the game she was playing. She was building a narrative, painting me as a bitter old man, a problem to be managed. I started to withdraw. I stopped taking my morning walks. The view from my back window was a constant reminder of my failure. It felt like they had already won. Then one rainy Wednesday, I went to a local diner for lunch, mostly just to get out of the house. I was sitting in a booth by myself when a group of men in expensive suits came in and sat behind me. They were loud, full of swagger. I heard them mention the new Evergreen Plaza development. It was one of the developers. He was bragging. "We fast-tracked the whole thing," he boasted to his friends. "The HOA had this chunk of surplus land they annexed completely undeveloped. Saved us a fortune on clearing and permits. We're putting up 12 commercial buildings. Got a dentist, a yoga studio, even a vape shop already signed on. Surplus land." That's what he called it. The casual arrogance of it hit me like a slap in the face. These people hadn't just stolen a piece of property. They had already sold it, leased it, and built a future on top of it without a second thought. They saw my family's land, my wife's memorial, as nothing more than a blank spot on a map that made their deal easier. I sat there stirring my coffee, and the anger I felt began to change. It cooled down, hardened into something else, something solid. That night, I didn't have the nightmare. I stayed up late in my office. I pulled out my father's original deed again, but this time I wasn't looking at it as a shield. I wasn't looking at it as proof of what I had lost. I smoothed the old paper out on my desk under the lamplight, tracing the boundary lines with my finger. They thought this piece of paper was a weakness, a sentimental relic. They had no idea. They had already built their buildings. They had already signed their tenants. They were so sure they had won. A quiet, cold idea began to form in my mind. An engineer's idea. Precise, methodical, and inescapable. The first phone call I made was to a man I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year. "Eddie," I said when he picked up. "It's Ray Dalton." There was a pause, then a gravelly voice on the other end. "Well, I'll be still breathing. Are you Dalton?" That was Eddie Lynn. We'd served together in the Navy, both in engineering. He was the best surveyor I ever knew, a man who trusted his gut, and a 100-year-old map more than any GPS. He'd retired to a small trailer out in the county, off-grid and off-temper. I told him the whole story from the backhoe to the forged plat. I didn't have to sell it. He just listened. When I was done, all he said was, "When do we start?" Eddie showed up the next day with his old equipment and a thermos of black coffee. He spent 2 days just walking the perimeter of my original land, using my deeds, metas, and bounds descriptions, sinking small, discreet iron stakes at the true corners. While he was doing that, I quietly paid a visit to the county records office again. This time, I wasn't just looking. I paid for certified copies of everything. My original deed, the official 1968 plat map showing my father's homestead, and the HOA's new forged plat. I also got the digital GIS data files from the county planning department. That weekend, my garage became a war room. We tacked the big official county map onto a piece of plywood on my workbench. Eddie had taken the digital data and printed the HOA's forged property lines and their new commercial building footprints onto large clear acetate sheets. It was an old-school technique, but it was brutally effective. He laid the first sheet, the forged boundary, over the real map. The lines didn't match. They were off by about 15 FT on the east side, just enough to make their fake annexation look plausible on paper. But the real moment came when he laid down the second overlay, the one showing the planned locations of the 12 commercial buildings. I felt my breath catch. It wasn't just a partial overlap. It wasn't 1 or 2 buildings on the line. All 12 of them, every single square foot of foundation, the parking lot, the utility hookups, the entire development sat squarely inside the true boundaries of my 5 acres. Not on their land, mine. Eddie just grunted. They didn't even bother to check, he said, shaking his head. Lazy and arrogant. It's a bad combination. We had them cold. It was all there on a clear piece of plastic. Undeniable. The next and hardest part of the plan began. I did nothing. I became the defeated old man they wanted me to be. I let my yard get a little overgrown. When my kids called, worried, I'd just say, "I'm looking at my options. The lawyers are handling it." I didn't tell them I hadn't hired one yet. I didn't tell anyone. I saw neighbors at the grocery store who would give me a sympathetic look. "Heard about what the HOA is doing to you, Ray. It's a shame." I'd just nod and say, "That's how it goes sometimes." Behind the chain-link fence, construction ramped up. The sounds changed from tearing down to building up. Concrete trucks rumbled in at dawn. The whine of saws and the pop of nail guns went on all day. I watched from my kitchen window as the skeletons of buildings rose from the mud. They worked fast. Soon the buildings had walls, then roofs. Signs went up. Evergreen Plaza opening soon. Banners appeared announcing future tenants. A dental office, a yoga studio, a vape shop, even a new real estate office. They were building their monument to greed on Sarah's quiet piece of earth. And I let them. Every dollar they spent was another nail in their own coffin. A month later, they held the ribbon-cutting ceremony. They set up a little stage and a podium right in the middle of the new parking lot. Tina Marston was there in a bright red power suit, her smile as wide and fake as a car salesman's. Camden Sharp stood beside her, looking smug in a tailored suit, pointing things out to the local news reporter. They talked about progress, community investment, and the bright future of the neighborhood. I watched it all from my window, a pair of binoculars in my hand. I saw them snip the big red ribbon with a pair of oversized golden scissors. I saw them toast each other with plastic cups of champagne. They were celebrating their victory, completely blind to the fact that their entire victory was built on quicksand. While they were congratulating themselves, I was making 2 quiet trips. The first was to the old county title office to get a certified title confirmation, an ironclad, legally recognized document stating I was the sole, unencumbered owner of my parcel. The second was to a litigator in the city, A shark I'd been researching for weeks. I didn't want to fight her. I wanted to finish her. I laid everything out on his conference table. The deed, the overlays, the certified title. He looked at it for 10 minutes, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back in his leather chair, and a slow grin spread across his face. "Mr. Dalton," he said, "they aren't just wrong. They're fraudulent. I'll take this case on contingency. They'll be paying my fee, not you." A few days later, a thick, glossy envelope appeared in my mailbox. It was an invitation, a grand opening gala for the Evergreen Plaza. Inside, on the heavy cardstock, someone had scribbled a note in black pen. "Thought you might want to see what progress looks like. Camden." It was meant to be the final insult, the last twist of the knife. I didn't get angry. I didn't feel a thing, except the cold click of the final piece of a machine falling into place. I picked up a red pen from the desk drawer and walked over to the calendar on my kitchen wall. I drew a firm, perfect circle around the date. The next few weeks were the strangest kind of quiet torture. I watched from my kitchen window as the Evergreen Plaza came to life. Cars started filling the freshly painted parking spots. A neon open sign lit up in the window of the vape shop. I saw a young mother pushing a stroller walk out of the yoga studio and a man in scrubs leaving the dentist's office. Life was happening over there. Business as usual on land they thought was theirs. Each car that pulled in, each dollar that was spent, was just digging the hole for the HOA a little bit deeper. They were smiling while they sank, and they had no idea. My lawyer and I had agreed on the timing. We would not act until they were fully operational, fully invested, and fully exposed. The time came on a Monday. My lawyer, a man named Marcus Thorne, drafted a single simple letter. It was addressed to the HOA's legal counsel. Inside the certified envelope were 3 things: a clean copy of my original notarized deed, a copy of Eddie's survey overlays showing the 12 buildings squarely on my land, and a 1-page demand for the immediate cessation of all operations and the vacating of my property within 30 days. It was a declaration of war, disguised as a polite inquiry. We sent it, and we waited. The response came a week later, just as Marcus predicted it would. It wasn't a phone call. It wasn't an offer to talk. It was a thick, angry-looking envelope from their high-priced law firm. It was a cease and desist letter. It accused me of harassment, of attempting to interfere with legitimate business operations, and of filing a frivolous claim. The language was aggressive and condescending. It threatened me with a countersuit for damages if I continued to bother their clients. It was signed by some junior partner with a fancy signature. Marcus read it over the phone to me. When he was done, I could almost hear him smiling. "They took the bait," he said. "They didn't even check their own filings. They just assume their money makes them right." I looked out the window at the bustling little strip mall. For the first time in months, I smiled too. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of an engineer who has just watched a complex machine perform exactly to specification. The next morning, Marcus filed 2 things at the county courthouse. The first was a quiet title action, a formal lawsuit asking a judge to declare once and for all that I was the sole legal owner of the land and that the HOA's claim was a cloud on my title. The second was a petition for a temporary injunction to freeze any further development, sales, or new leases on the property until the ownership question was settled. This was no longer about letters. This was official. The court date was set for a month away. The HOA was served the papers the next day. Their reaction was exactly what you'd expect from a bully who just got punched in the nose for the first time: public ridicule. The next monthly HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse. I usually didn't go, but I made sure to be there for this one. I sat in the back, just listening. Tina Marston was running the meeting, and she made a special point to address the unfortunate legal nuisance they were dealing with. Camden Sharp took the microphone, a smirk plastered on his face. He didn't use my name, but everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. "We have a certain individual," he said, gesturing vaguely in my direction, "who is having a hard time accepting progress. Some people just can't let go of the past." He paused for effect. "We've been advised by our lawyers that this is nothing more than a desperate attempt by a bitter old man clinging to dirt." A few people in the audience chuckled. Tina Marston stepped up to the podium, placing her hand on Camden's shoulder, as if he were a conquering hero. "We have made this community better," she declared, her voice ringing with self-importance. "We have brought in new businesses, created value. Some people can't stand to see success. You," she said, finally looking directly at me, her eyes cold, "are the past. This plaza is the future." The room was quiet. I stood up slowly. Every eye was on me. I didn't shout. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her, at all of them on the board. And I let the truth land in the quiet space between us. "I buried my wife on that land," I said, my voice steady and clear. "You built vape shops on her grave. For a second, you could have heard a pin drop." Then a few of the board members, led by Camden, let out forced, awkward laughs as if I'd told a pathetic joke. But the laughter died quickly. It didn't spread through the crowd. Instead, I saw people shifting in their seats. I saw neighbors who used to avoid my gaze suddenly looking at me, then at the board, then back at me. The smiles on Tina's and Camden's faces faltered. For the first time, they looked uncertain. They had tried to paint me as a crazy old man. But in that room, with that one simple truth, I had just painted them as monsters. They didn't know it yet, but their world was already starting to crumble. The day of the court hearing felt different. The air was still and cool, the kind of morning that feels like a held breath. My lawyer, Marcus, picked me up. I wasn't wearing a suit. I wore my old navy dress blues, the jacket a little tighter in the shoulders now, but it still felt right. It felt honest. When we walked into the courthouse, I was surprised to see a couple of cameras from a local news station set up in the back of the courtroom. The reporter, a young woman with a microphone, was talking to her cameraman. The story of the bitter old man versus the big HOA development had apparently made for a slow news day. Good. I wanted people to see this. We took our seats at our designated table. A few minutes later, the doors swung open, and in they came. The HOA All-Stars. Their lawyer led the way. A man with silver hair and a briefcase that probably cost more than my first car. Behind him was Tina Marston, dressed in a sharp navy blue pantsuit, her chin held high, a smug little smile playing on her lips. Camden Sharp was with her, looking like a peacock in a ridiculously expensive-looking suit, his hair slicked back. He caught my eye and gave me a little nod, a look that said, "You really brought a knife to a gunfight, old man." Tailing them was the developer I'd seen in the diner, his face a mask of bored indifference. They were a team radiating an aura of untouchable confidence. They looked like winners. When the judge called my case, Marcus gave me a short nod. We walked up to the plaintiff's table. Their entire legal team settled in across from us. The judge, a woman named O'Connell with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression, looked down at the paperwork. "Mr. Thorne," she said to Marcus, "your client is making a rather extraordinary claim against a major community development. I trust you have more than just sentiment to present." Before Marcus could speak, I said, "Your Honor, may I approach the display? Easel?" The judge looked at me, then at Marcus, who nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Dalton." I walked over to the easel my lawyer had set up. I was carrying a cardboard tube in a portfolio. I felt every eye in the room on me. I didn't feel nervous. I just felt focused. I took a deep breath and began. First, I unrolled the large original 1968 county plat map and pinned it to the board. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, "this is the official map of the county section as it has existed for over 50 years. I used a wooden pointer to trace a boundary line. This is the land deeded to my father, and then to me. 5 acres. The boundaries are clear." Next, I took out the acetate sheet Eddie and I had prepared. It was the HOA's forged plat map, the lines printed in red. I carefully laid it over the official map. The room was silent. You could see it instantly. The red lines of the forgery didn't match the black lines of the truth. "This," I said, tapping the red line, "is the map the HOA filed 8 months ago. This is their claim." Then I took out the final piece, another clear sheet. This one with the 12 buildings of the Evergreen Plaza drawn on it in blue. I placed it over the other 2 layers. The effect was brutal. The entire blue footprint of the strip mall, every building, every parking space, was nestled perfectly inside the original black boundary line of my property. Not even close to the edge, a dead center bullseye. "This is the land they built on," I said simply. "Here is where the boundary was by law." I tapped the black line, and here I tapped the red line again. "Is the forgery they used to do it." Their lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a folksy presentation, but it is not evidence. My clients filed the proper annexation paperwork with the county. This is pure theatrics." Judge O'Connell didn't even look at him. She was staring at the maps, her expression unreadable. She held up a hand. "Sit down, counselor," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. "I am finding this folksy presentation to be exceptionally clear." She turned her gaze to Marcus. "Mr. Thorne." Marcus stood. He wasn't theatrical. He was a surgeon. "Your Honor, we have a sworn affidavit from the county clerk of records. She confirms that the official plat map on file is the one Mr. Dalton first presented. She also confirms that the document the HOA filed, the one with the red lines, bears a forged signature of the county surveyor and a fraudulent filing number. To be clear, the county has no legal record of this annexation ever taking place. Their map is fake. That was it. The pin was pulled. A ripple of gasps went through the public gallery. The news cameraman suddenly hoisted his camera onto his shoulder, the red light blinking on. Judge O'Connell looked from the maps back to the HOA's table. Her voice was cold iron. "The court has reviewed the evidence presented by the plaintiff and the testimony from the county clerk. It is the finding of this court that the property in question, known as Parcel 7A, is the legal and sole property of Mr. Raymond Dalton." She wasn't done. She looked directly at Tina and Camden. "Furthermore, the court finds that the entirety of the commercial development, known as Evergreen Plaza, sits on that private property. The community association holds no legal deed, no right, and no claim to any of the land on which these structures were built." The courtroom erupted. Reporters were scribbling furiously. The developer's jaw had literally dropped open. Their lawyer was shuffling his papers, his face pale. Then beside him, Tina Marston made a small, strangled noise. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and she slumped sideways in her chair, fainting dead away. It wasn't a delicate swoon. It was a total collapse. As people rushed to her side, Camden Sharp shoved his chair back and made a run for the side door. He was halfway there when the judge's voice boomed through the courtroom. "Mr. Sharp, you will return to your seat now." Camden froze, his hand on the doorknob. He turned slowly, his face a mask of pure panic. The show was over. The trap had closed. Leaving the courthouse felt like walking out of a pressure chamber. The news crew ambushed us on the steps, but Marcus handled them, giving a brief professional statement. I just stood behind him, silent. The real work wasn't over. The court order was a piece of paper. Now I had to turn that paper into reality. The next morning, I drove to a print shop. I had them print a dozen large official-looking notices. At the top, in big bold letters, it said, "Notice of Eviction." Below that, it clearly stated the court's ruling, the parcel number of the land, and the fact that the current occupants were trespassing on private property. It gave them 30 days to vacate. I signed each one, my name feeling heavier and more solid than it had in months. Then, I walked over to the Evergreen Plaza. It was a beautiful, sunny day. The yoga studio had its door propped open. The vape shop had a customer. I walked up to the first business, the dentist's office, opened the glass door, and taped the eviction notice squarely in the center of it. I did the same for every single one of the 12 businesses. The looks on their faces as they read the notice, confusion turning to panic, was something to see. They weren't the enemy. Not really. They were just casualties in a war the HOA started. The HOA's response was as predictable as it was pathetic. They tried to play the victim. Tina Marston, having miraculously recovered from her courtroom fainting spell, launched a smear campaign. An emergency newsletter went out to the entire community. It painted me as a greedy, vindictive old man who was trying to destroy small businesses and ruin the community's progress out of pure spite. They started a petition on the community Facebook page titled "Save Evergreen Plaza from a Hostile Takeover." They were trying to twist the narrative to make it seem like they were the ones being attacked. They conveniently left out the part about the forgery, the fraud, and the fact that they'd built their precious plaza on stolen land. That's when my daughter, who works in marketing, gave me an idea. "Dad," she said, "they're controlling the story. You need to tell your side." So we did. We set up a small camera on a tripod in my living room. I just sat in my armchair, the original deed, and the acetate maps on the coffee table in front of me. The video was titled, "Here's How My HOA Stole My Land to Build a Strip Mall." I didn't yell. I didn't use fancy words. I just walked through the story piece by piece, just like I did in the courtroom. I showed the maps. I showed the deed. I told them about Sarah's bench. I kept it simple, clear, and true. We posted it on HOA Tragedies that night. I figured a few neighbors might see it. By the next morning, it had 10,000 views. By the end of the day, 50,000. By the end of the weekend, it had over 200,000 views and was climbing. The comment section was a flood. I couldn't believe it. Hundreds, then thousands of comments from all over the country, all over the world. Veterans, contractors, surveyors, retired engineers, people who had fought their own battles with corrupt HOAs. They understood the maps. They understood the language. They saw the fraud for exactly what it was. "That's how it's done," one comment said. "Let them build the gallows, then spring the trap." Another wrote, "Competence over arrogance." A classic Navy win. The local news stations that had ignored the story before were suddenly calling me non-stop. The HOA's narrative had crumbled to dust in 48 hours. The business owners in the plaza started to scramble. Their leases with the HOA were now worthless pieces of paper. Some of them, the angrier ones, called me and yelled. Most were just scared. A few of them came to my door asking what was going to happen. I gave all of them the same choice. It was a simple offer. "You can stay," I told them. "You can sign a new lease with me for a fair market rate, or you have 30 days to vacate the premises." There was no negotiation. It was a simple business proposition. Take it or leave it, most of them left. The cost of breaking their old, voided leases and moving was less than staying. The dentist's office was the first to go. Then the yoga studio. Moving trucks started showing up every other day. The vibrant, bustling plaza was slowly hollowing out, becoming a ghost town. The final blow landed a week later. Armed with the court ruling and the public outcry from the video, Marcus filed a second lawsuit. This time, we weren't suing the HOA as an entity. We were suing Tina Marston, Camden Sharp, and every other board member individually for fraud, conspiracy, and property theft. That was the kill shot. The HOA's insurance providers sent them a letter the very next day informing them that since the board had engaged in deliberate criminal fraud, their directors' and officers' liability coverage was void. They were on their own. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Tina Marston resigned live on the community Facebook page, delivering a tearful, rambling speech where she blamed everything on the reckless and deceitful actions of Camden Sharp. She tried to paint herself as just another victim. No one bought it. Days later, after the county prosecutor's office opened a formal investigation based on the evidence from my case, Camden was arrested at his home and charged with multiple counts of forgery and filing false public records. He was out of the HOA game for good. The last of the moving trucks pulled out of the Evergreen Plaza at the end of the month, leaving behind 12 empty buildings and a parking lot full of silence. The day after they left, I hired a fencing company. They tore down the ugly chain-link fence the HOA had put up and installed a simple, sturdy split-rail fence, just like the one that had been there before. The crunching sound of the posts going into the ground was a good sound this time. It was the sound of something being made right. That same week, I went to a lumber yard and bought some thick oak planks. I spent a few days in my garage sanding and sealing the wood. I built a new bench identical to the one they had destroyed. I didn't take it down to the stream right away. I just let it sit there, smelling of fresh stain and sawdust. A promise to myself. I was reclaiming more than just land. I was reclaiming a memory. Something strange started to happen in the neighborhood. People who had been silent for months, the ones who had given me those sympathetic but distant looks in the grocery store, started to stop by. One of my neighbors, a guy named Frank, came over while I was working on the fence. He told me that Tina Marston had fined him $300 last year because his kid's basketball hoop was an inch too close to the sidewalk. Another neighbor, a young woman who lived down the street, told me the HOA had tried to force her to resod her entire lawn because they didn't like the shade of green. It turned out almost everyone had a story. They had all been bullied, fined, and intimidated into silence by Tina and her board. My fight had become their fight, and now that the bullies were gone, they weren't afraid to talk anymore. Camden Sharp was convicted 6 months later. He pled guilty to forgery in a deal to avoid a longer sentence. The last I heard of Tina Marston, she'd sold her house at a loss and moved out of state. Her empire had crumbled, and her name was mud. The HOA was in shambles, facing lawsuits from the developer and the evicted tenants. At a special election, an entirely new board was voted in. A group of longtime residents who were tired of the old way of doing things. One of their first official acts was to pass a new rule, which they unofficially called the Dalton Rule. It stated that no property could ever be annexed or rezoned by the association without a 100% unanimous vote from every single homeowner. Their power to just take things was gone for good. One Saturday afternoon in the early fall, I rented a couple of big charcoal grills and sent out an email to the neighborhood. The subject line was just potluck. I invited everyone to a get-together, not at the community clubhouse, but on the vast empty concrete slab where the vape shop and the yoga studio used to be. I didn't know if anyone would come, but they did. Dozens of them. They brought folding chairs, coolers, and covered dishes. Kids drew with sidewalk chalk where the parking lines used to be and threw frisbees across the empty asphalt. Frank, the guy with the basketball hoop, clapped me on the shoulder. "You know, Ray," he said, looking around at the crowd, "this is the most community I have ever seen in this community." After the party, when everyone had gone home, I finally carried the new bench down the hill. I placed it by the stream in the exact spot the old one had been. The woods were already starting to reclaim the scarred earth. New saplings were pushing up through the dirt. It would take time, but it would heal. My lawsuit against the board members settled out of court. It was a substantial amount. I used some of it to pay Marcus Thorne, who had earned every penny. I used some more to set up a small community fund, a legal defense resource for any homeowner in the county who was facing an unjust fight with their HOA. No one should have to face that kind of power alone. I sat down on the bench as the evening light filtered through the trees. The water in the stream ran clear again. I thought about what they had done, their arrogance and their greed. They thought I was too old to fight, that I'd just roll over and accept their made-up rules. They thought the land was just dirt, a blank space on a map for them to fill with profit. But they were wrong. Land holds memory. It holds truth. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, it holds the trap they walked right into. That land is mine, and it always was.